Welcome to another edition of the Bordering on Belief podcast. Today we're going to be discussing morality from both a theistic and atheistic perspective. With me to discuss this are Professor Paul Moser, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy from Loyola University in Chicago, who will be presenting a theistic perspective, and Professor Richard Norman, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy from the University of Kent, who will be presenting an atheistic or humanistic perspective. So we're going to be dividing this discussion of quite a complex topic into three main areas. The first is on the grounding of morality. Why is something morally right or wrong? What gives moral rules their authority? What makes them real? What type of things are they? Are they just opinions, preferences, and so on? So the ground of morality. The second section is going to be on how morality arises in humans. How do humans have a conscience? Where did that come from? And the third section is going to be on the concept of moral change or progress or regression. Does it exist? How do we decide whether something is progress or not? And if so, what does that have to say about both the theistic and atheistic takes on this subject? So just to start us off, Paul, could you just tell us a little bit about what you mean by morality, what it is, what type of thing it is, and what you think grounds it?
I think the best way to look at morality in general is in terms of three broad categories. The first one is the category of the good, that is, what is good or evil. The second category is that of right and wrong, permissibility or obligation. And the third main category is that of praise and blame, praiseworthiness and blameworthiness. Those cover a lot of the terrain in the kind of ethical theory that philosophers worry about. And as I see things, moral truths arise from moral facts. There are facts of the matter. Just as there are empirical scientific facts, there are moral facts. For example, it's a fact that we should not torture infants. It's a fact that Trump and his goons should not deport innocent people in the U.S. to Uganda and elsewhere. That's a moral fact. And in going against it, they are doing something immoral. That's what we're in the middle of now in the U.S., and it is indeed a moral issue and not just a legal issue. Children are frightened. Women are frightened. It's a kind of intimidation tactic that actually tortures people. The fact of the matter morally is that we should not do that. And that's not just a theist view. An atheist can acknowledge moral facts, objective moral facts. There's a whole school of ethics coming out of Cornell University and Richard Boyd, which is staunchly atheist, but acknowledges moral realism, moral facts. So it's just nonsense to say an atheist can't be a moral realist. That's not where the rub comes. The rub comes in a different area, in the question of why should I be moral when morality is inconvenient? Let me give a quick example. This month, a close friend of mine died, philosophy professor, teacher of ethics, and had spent his life working on questions of ethics. And in the end, he fell prey to a kind of mental decay and ultimately death. Now, if his death is final, he spent his life building a moral character that came to naught, futility, nothing. And that's just a fact of the matter if atheism is true. There is no sustainer of his morally good character. It will not survive death. He's done and gone. And so there's no hope for sustained goodness in an atheist story because there's no source for such sustenance of moral goodness. And so the question is, why be moral when it's inconvenient? It's easy to be moral when it's convenient. We can do it. We can boast about it, wear a badge of honor. But how about when it's not convenient, when I stand to lose maybe even my life? Shouldn't I cut moral corners?
Richard, what are your thoughts in response to some of the things Paul said?
Well, let's go back to Paul's initial three categories. And I'd want to say, I'll focus on the first two of those, the notion of the good and the notion of right and wrong and obligations. And I would say that they are fundamentally intertwined. My notion of the grounding of morality is that our moral values are grounded in facts about what enables us to flourish as communal beings. Again, those 2 points are intimately connected. We only flourish as communal beings in society. And our fundamental moral values are values that are built into our social relationships as communal beings. Values of kindness and compassion and care for one another, values of fairness and justice, values of honesty and loyalty. These are essential values for enabling human beings to flourish in communities. And there are, I agree with Paul, there are facts of the matter. There are facts that we need those values, that they are part and parcel of our moral life. I should say, incidentally, that I agree with Paul's more specific examples of moral facts, and I'm pleased that he brought those in as well. But then let me also take up the issues that he raised towards the end of what he was saying. I think there are actually two different issues there. There's the question of how we sustain our commitment to those values when the going gets tough. I think that's a bit different from the issue that he raised as a point of difference between theistic and atheistic perspectives, which was the problem more about the sustainability of them. If we are purely mortal beings, doesn't it all in the end in futility? And really, my answer to that would be to link back to the point about moral values as rooted in community. So the values that we live by aren't just personal to ourselves. They are values that we help to sustain through our living in communities, through our relationships with other people. And to the extent that we live by those values, we are thereby sustaining those values for other people in other people's lives. And hopefully we transmit those values to others, most obviously members of our family, those who are close to us, but through the wider world as well. And I think, the hope that I live by, the faith, if you like, that I live by, is the faith that those values continue because they're so deeply embedded in human life and other people will take them forward. So the fact of our own individual mortality doesn't, for me, undermine the importance and significance of those values.
Richard's presented there that there's sufficient grounding for morality in the flourishing of humanity. We don't need to appeal to any greater grounding than that. And also the enduring nature of your friend's moral life is in what was passed on to other people, the teachings he gave, the example he set. What do you say to both of those things?
Yes, that won't quite work once we focus in on how the flourishing works, because in the case of my friend, a lot of the hard work he did for his moral character won't be passed on. And even if it is, the community at large is going down the same road, namely the road to destruction, where their effort at character building will die. It will wither and die as they approach death. And eventually, as our science tells us, the whole species is going to go under. So we can't appeal just to a vague notion of community flourishing, because we need to know how, in the hard cases where morality is really hard, why we shouldn't cut corners.
Just on that, Paul, could you just give us an example, a concrete example of such a thing where the argument that morality is about community flourishing just doesn't hold up when you're talking about not cutting corners? Give an example of that.
Take theft. Take a case of theft where it's too bad those guys in London didn't get away with the jewelry theft that they tried a couple of weeks ago. I think, by the way, were they actually put in jail? I think one or two of them were, and they were looking for some others. But the point is, you can get away with stealing and not harm anybody. In fact, some people are so wealthy that you're stealing from them wouldn't be missed at all. and you could take advantage of it by, say, using the theft in a better way. Your refusing to steal here will not enhance community. It doesn't, there's no law-like connection. This is the bad assumption in Richard's position, that there's some kind of law-like connection between doing what's right or advancing the good and enhancing the community. There's no such law-like connection. At best, there's a correlation in some cases and maybe a causal influence in some, but we aren't going to get a general defense of morality by appealing to a flourishing community. I can do a lot of things that, in fact, are neutral on the flourishing of the community, and those things aren't morally acceptable. Theft is one of them. We could think of similar cases where I engage in certain immoral behavior without the community harming. And so when the going gets tough in morality, the question should be, for an atheist, why not cut some corners here? Nobody's going to be harmed, and we can easily imagine a case like that. So I'm going to cut corners morally. And on top of it all, I see that as I approach death, it's going to be final. I'm not going to be accountable. I'm not going to need to advance any moral cause. And the same is true of everybody else. They're in the same boat if atheism is true. Why? Because there's no sustainer of the moral goodness or rightness that we work so hard to sustain if we are ethical people.
Okay,
So
let me put that
when
put that to Richard. You gave an example there of theft, and it's possible to do something which we would both all agree is morally wrong, yet it doesn't necessarily impinge on the community, and there isn't a causal link between these two things. So to therefore assert that is the grounding is slightly deficient.
Well, let me make a couple of further comments, and then I'd like to put a question to Paul, if I may. First of all, just to try to, to give, again, to make concrete this notion of the continuity across generations. I mean, if I think about my relationship to my father, the values that he lived by are values that I try to sustain and to continue. And I don't see that as just a matter of chance. I mean, that's an important part of how I think of my relationship to him, that I'm, as it were, morally, morally one with him in the things that we live by, and which I inherited from him, and which I hope other people will inherit from me. So it's not just a sort of vague, abstract belief that I'm talking about here. It's something that's very real in people's lives. Now, to come to your example of theft, I think it's important to distinguish here, and it's a distinction that's familiar in the philosophical literature, the distinction between the idea that particular actions are to be judged according to how far they contribute to well-being, and ways of life. And what I'd want to focus on is the latter, the idea that certain ways of living, which go beyond just choices about individual actions, it's through those that, through ways of life, that moral values become part and parcel of our living in a community. So the question is not, can I do more good for myself or for other people by stealing on this particular occasion? The question is, how do I want to live in relation to other people? Do I want to be the kind of person that lives in harmony with other people, in community with other people, by acknowledging what I owe to them and what they owe to me? It's at that level, I think, that the link with human flourishing in community comes in. Though I should say also that I'm not an absolutist in the sense of thinking that even theft is totally ruled out. There are conceivable situations in which that there might be good reasons for it. The presumption is always that's the value that we should live by. So the question I want to put to Paul is, how does being theistic help with that problem?
Well, let me come back to the community standard and flourishing community. We need more, Richard, because there are different ways to individuate communities. There's even a theft community. The people who pulled off this jewelry theft in London in broad daylight, they were part of a larger community of thieves. And they wanted to enhance, I think, the activity in that community. And so we have to decide how we're going to individuate the communities that are going to set the standard. And I don't see why, on an atheist view, a person couldn't say,
Right.
oh yeah, in general, I'm not going to steal and get caught and embarrass my family. But there are cases where I'm going to take shortcuts because it's more convenient. And I've got nothing to lose, nothing. Nobody's going to hold me accountable in the fullness of time or even in the presence of time. But on a theistic view, you have a standard of accountability from a personal agent who says, don't do that. That is not good for you, quite aside from what could happen in the community. I mean, I could play a Robin Hood story and say, hey, I'm doing it for the poor in the community, but still, a moral agent who is perfect, I think, would say, wait a minute here. You don't get to go consequentialist in that cheap way. Some things are wrong, and I'm here to tell you what they are. So we need a standard of accountability beyond what atheism provides, or we get moral cutting of corners. And that cutting of corners can't be excluded just by saying we want to benefit the community. Which community? How do you individuate the community? Maybe it's a community that takes advantage of theft when nobody's really harmed. And that's why I like the jewel thieves. They steal from people who are filthy rich and generally don't harm a lot of people. And when they get away with it, I kind of add a clause of maybe they're Robin Hood types. Maybe they're going to throw some at charity.
I'm just going to put that back to Richard. Do you feel he's answered the question?
Well, first of all, on the issue of individuating communities, I mean, communities are not, isolated from one another. We live in a world of innumerable overlapping communities. So the jewel thieves don't just live in a thieves' world. That itself is part of a larger world, overlapping with all sorts of other communities, neighborhoods, larger communities than that, and so forth. So the question is not, I'm not taking a relativistic position here. I'm not saying that values are specific to particular separate communities. I'm saying that they are part and parcel of the fact of living in communities in general. Let me come back, if I may, though, on the theistic point, because as I understood it, your answer is, well, there's a, if one's theistic, then there is an overarching standard about how we should live in communities, which is the standard which is laid down for us by a divine will. But then the question I want to put to you, which is a familiar question for positions of that kind, which is then, does God will that we should avoid theft and act honestly simply because it's his will, or does he will it because it's a value that we need as human beings, given our nature as social beings, as the kinds of beings he has created us to be? If it's the latter, then your position merges with mine, I think. If it's the former, then haven't you got the familiar problem that in the end, the right and wrong just comes down to the power of an arbitrary will?
Yeah, and the answer is no, because the Euthyphro problem misses a huge step, namely a basis in the very character of God that is deeper than an arbitrary will. And if God is morally perfect, that is instantiating morality without defect, then the issue is what fits with God's character, not just God's will. Isn't God arbitrarily? It's God reflecting moral perfection that can't be reduced to human community needs. It goes the other way. Because of this perfection, human communities should reflect what God's character is. And God's will does line up with that, but that's not the ultimate story. So Plato missed a crucial step there. And incidentally, Augustine moved in the right direction on the Euthyphro problem, but then screwed everything up with his view of sovereignty and led to all kinds of disastrous views. So we can answer the Euthyphro problem given God's character. But what I'm suggesting is, even if there is one large community, we can talk that way, the human community. But notice, it's going to have all kinds of inconsistencies. I mean, you got the Trumpites saying you can go down to Venezuela and murder people. You've got them saying, wipe out the immigrants here if you want, if they have brown skin. And then you got other people saying, wait a minute, this is evil and this is morally reprehensible. So an appeal to one large community is not going to help us.
Okay. Richard, did Paul's answer convince
comment
you?
on that, if I may, on what Paul referred to as the Euthyphro problem. Perhaps for listeners, I should explain that the Euthyphro problem is so called because it's referring to a work by the Greek philosopher Plato, the Euthyphro, which famously was the first text to set out this dilemma. Is what's right because God commands it, or does command it because it's right? And it seems to me, Paul, if I may say so, that you're still stuck with that dilemma, aren't you? You say, well, no, because we have to look at the character of God, and God is morally good. But then that raises the same dilemma again, isn't it? What do we mean by saying that God is morally good? If we mean by that God is morally good because he obeys the commands that he gives, well, then we're just in a logical circle. If we say God is morally good because his will and his behavior conforms to moral values that are independent of him, then we're back to a position that doesn't depend on the idea of a divine will.
And you shouldn't take either of those views, and Augustine didn't. God is ultimately good because of the very character of God, namely the moral properties that God instantiates in advance of volitional or willing properties. So there's that third option, and it isn't covered by the two that you mentioned.
I still don't know what's meant on that view by saying God is morally good.
God instantiates only morally good properties. Forget about the will. Forget about God's will. God is a being with personality traits. The personality traits instantiate moral properties of goodness. That's different from anything Plato suggested. He just missed the boat on this one. And Augustine did move in the right direction, but as I say, bungled the whole story, as he does in a lot of cases.
We need to move on to the next topic. I'm aware that we probably haven't resolved that problem.
I think we've reached the point where we're not going to resolve it. Yes.
Exactly, yes, and hasn't been resolved for thousands of years. So
right.
The next thing is really about how morality arises in humans. What is the origin of it? How does conscience appear in humans? Richard, why don't you kick us off on this?
Well, my answer to that question would follow very directly from what I was saying in answer to your first question. The moral values arise from our evolution as social beings. All the evidence is that early humans and early hominids always existed in communities and evolved as communities and evolved as they did because they were communal beings. It's also a feature of human communities that, given the way in which newborn humans mature and develop, that they remain within a family unit for a long period of time. So very deep bonds emerge between human beings through that strong role of family life. Human beings, as they grow, because of the kinds of evolved beings that they are, form bonds with one another, identify with one another, respond to one another's feelings, are moved and motivated by the well-being and suffering of of other human beings. Now, initially, that's rooted in immediate family groups and small community groups. But as human beings develop that responsiveness to other human beings, they gradually learn to recognize the shared humanity of other human beings outside the immediate group. And it's on that capacity for empathy that we build up our sense of our relationship to other human beings and what we owe to them. But then, as part of the evolutionary process, the gradual development of language, human beings have also developed the capacity to reflect on those instinctive reactions and instinctive forms of response to other human beings, have learned to generalize them into values that transcend particular situations, and to think of their relationships to other people in those terms, in terms of the kinds of values we've just been talking about. So that's the kind of, in short, that's a kind of evolutionary story which I would want to tell.
Okay, Paul, morality arises in humans because of genes, upbringing, community, and then advanced cerebrum, which allows us to reflect on all of this and establish concepts. What do you think?
Well, I know of nobody who has convincingly connected morality to genetics, even if genetics figure in a capability of morality. They certainly don't establish any particular moral story. Now, back in the day, I was at Vanderbilt with Alistair McIntyre, and he was always holding forth on communities and narrative community for communities, and the after virtue stuff about narratives and communities. And I was never convinced and disagreed with him endlessly, because the story has to start somewhere. It doesn't start with the community. Individuals are on the scene in advance of building communities, and they have to be explained too, as do moral reformers who stand up and go against the moral community, and rightly so. As of 100 years ago in the U.S., women couldn't vote. That was a community view. They aren't up to it. They're unqualified. And the whole damn community seemed to be in agreement with it, until one or two women said, enough is enough. What are you people doing? Male dominance of the worst sort. So the story can't be community consensus or community formation of values, because in many cases, the community goes morally wrong, and it needs a kind of starter somewhere that itself won't be a community.
So where does it come from in your view?
Now, on a theistic view, and this is, I think, common to all monotheistic traditions, the very spirit of God makes humans different from a lot of other animals, and does so with a moral influence. And so John's gospel can say the Logos enlightens every person who comes into the world. Genesis has God breathing life into humans and holding them accountable or responsible. So what happens in the theistic story is that God is active. God takes a role in setting up humans, at least, maybe other animals, but at least humans, to be morally distinguishing, morally capable, with moral concepts. Now, I have 3 wonderful cats. They're the best cats in the world. I'm not sure their moral depth is terribly deep. It might be a little deep, but I don't think it's terribly deep. They don't debate moral issues with me. They probably know better than I do, so they don't even bother. But anyway, I think that with humans, you get a real difference from a lot of the other animal world in its moral discernment, moral discrimination, and we have no reason to believe that that's just genetic, or we have no reason to believe that somehow a community pulled that out of a hat. It's not going to work that way, because the community needs to get started somewhere, and to accommodate moral reformers. A single individual can stand up and say, I don't give a damn about the community on women voting. They should be able to vote. And notice, that's not a community position.
Well, I'll hand that back to Richard. What do you think of Paul's points there?
The point about genetics. I mean, I'm not trying to infer anything from genetics, not least because I don't know a lot about genetics. But I don't think that the nature of human genetics is the clue to the answers to this. I agree with you in a sense when you say the individual is before society. I mean, clearly that's not the case in a chronological sense, but I take you to be saying there that to know how it is that we live in communities, we have to look at what human beings are like. And biologically, scientifically speaking, genetics may be the basis of that, but it's not genetics that tells us the answer to that question. Now, your position, I take it then, Paul, is that what's important is the specific nature with which a divine creator endowed us. I mean, to tell a story about a divine creator there, you first of all got to identify independently what it is about human beings that you need to explain by the action of a divine creator. When Christians, for example, talk about human beings being made in the image of God and being different from cats or whatever, the first thing to be said is, well, what is it about human beings that leads us to say that about them, that they are made in the image of God in a way that cats aren't? Though, maybe you need to get better cats, but I take the point. So
that's not possible.
If it comes back to claims about what it is to be human, then surely we have the same starting point. You will then explain that in terms of a divine creator who made us in that way, but our notion of what it is to be human and how that underpins our capacity to have values and to reflect on our relationships to other people and to reflect on and consider how we act on those values is going to coincide, isn't it? One other point to make is that, again, as I said earlier, I think I'm not just appealing to the idea of a moral consensus here, that people just happen to agree on things. The values that we're talking about, values of fairness and honesty and loyalty, are not just a moral consensus. They are part and parcel of what it is to be human social beings. But the important point, which I'd like to know your thoughts on, isn't our notion of what it is to be human prior to our notion of whether that is to be explained by the activity of a divine creator.
I think the role of human conscience, CONSCIENCE, not consciousness, conscience, is critical. I don't see it in other animal species. And here I attend to Jane Goodall, who, by the way, passed away recently, and herself was a devout theist Christian and acknowledged a lasting moral good, a lasting hope. And people have written on this in recent weeks. A wonderful woman, by the way, Jane Goodall,
Mm-hmm.
and spent much time with apes and animals a lot like us, and examined their moral behavior. The role of moral conscience is critical. It isn't the role here of being human. Notice, the category of the human can't serve here because a lot of humans are mentally very defective. It's the notion of a person who's human that's critical, not the biological category of human. That's just a physical, bodily category, but the notion of a person as an agent with a moral conscience and moral responsibility, now that takes us into the domain that I'm talking about, and I'm suggesting that it's no accident that that domain is so very rare and isn't just sloppily spread out across all species. It just isn't. When you get to humans, something is different in kind. I mean, we evaluate morally sometimes whatever is put before us. That doesn't happen outside our species, even with the great apes. I mean, and they're very close to us biologically. So we're not going to be able to tell a story in terms of being human. The biology is too uneven and too mixed. But what the monotheistic story holds is that God did something special with humans by giving them a moral conscience when those humans are persons, when they're actual personal agents. And in that case, what happens is you have a basis for a community coming together in moral agreement. But notice that the community itself is a result of the moral activity. It isn't the cause or foundation of it.
Okay, Richard, I'll give you one final comment on that before we move to the final section.
Happy to go along with the notion of that, that human beings are distinguished by other species in a way that's a difference in kind. And I don't want to describe it just in biological terms, although of course it has a biological basis. But the actual features that make human beings a particular unique kind of species as persons has to be spelled out in terms of the kinds of ways in which human beings think and behave and relate to one another. So though it has a biological basis, it's not just a biological thing. And okay, yes, we can say, an important part of that is our possession of conscience. Now, again, I don't see why, from an atheist perspective, I can't agree with that. I can't say the same thing. Yes, it's just it's distinctive of us as human beings that we have something we can call conscience. I'd want to relate that to the other things that I've been saying about moral values and why we act on them and how we relate to one another. But that's again a fact about about our nature as human persons, if you like. But that still leaves the capacity to recognize that as something that I can say just as much as you can. And I'm not sure that bringing in the idea of a divine creator adds anything to that notion of conscience and the distinctiveness of human persons as possessors of conscience.
Yeah, I think it adds a lot. And if Muhammad, I could go on for 1 second.
Sure.
Given the role of God, the human conscience is morally interactive with a standard higher than itself. And if we want to get serious about these moral values and not just make them convenient, love of enemies. When Jesus comes on the scene and reflects the Old Testament command to love your enemies, that is the people who hate you and want to kill you, that's a rare position. And I'd like to see an atheist basis for it, because on an atheist view of morality, we are all in a funeral procession. It's a funeral procession to a final end. Let's be candid. Let's just be candid. That's what our science teaches. That's what the metaphysics teaches, if atheism is true. And so join the funeral procession and add morality to it. But here's the problem. Why on the way to the dustbin of history should I love my damn enemies? They're out to kill me. They're out to harm me and my family. I'm to love them? Atheism has no basis for that view, but the God of Jesus does, because this God can sustain you through death, can redeem your enemies if they're willing, and can use you to that end. So there's a world of difference between the theist view and conscience and the atheist view.
Okay, Richard, do other great apes?
Yes, we're coming back to this notion of whether there's a continuing future. I mean, the fact that scientifically our Earth will not exist in millions of years' time doesn't particularly bother me, and I don't think it pulls the ground from under the feet of morality. If it's more short term than that, then I just want to come back to what I was saying earlier. We live in continuing human communities, continuing relationships with others, with future generations, and that's what we need in order to sustain our sense of the importance of the values that we live by.
But Richard, it's not a philosophical answer to say that doesn't bother me. I can play that card at every turn. No. That doesn't bother me.
It shouldn't bother anybody.
You. And well, but it should bother everybody, because we're all in the same boat or community on your story, and all of it's going to the junk bin of history. And I want to come back to Muhammad. I'm glad he finally jumped in. Do great apes love their enemies? I think they're like humans. Typically, they don't love their enemies, and they're different in kind from human persons. I think their moral discrimination is at a lower level, even though I love them. I love what Jane Goodall did for them. And same for my cats, the best in the world. A different kind of agent. So, Muhammad, that's my answer to your question.
Okay. I think we need to move on to the final section so that we give it justice. Is there such a thing as moral progress? There appears to be moral change. Ethics, moralities appear to change over time. What one community in one time thought was right, another community 100 years later thinks is completely wrong. Is there such a thing as moral progress? And if so, what does that say about the atheistic and theistic accounts of morality? Richard?
Well, yes, I think there is such a thing as moral progress. And at heart, I think it's a progress in recognizing the humanity of the other. What Paul was just saying about coming to love one's enemies is very, very germane here. I think it's one. As history progresses, human beings more and more come into contact with one another. They can no longer just other different societies as being not really like us and not really human. The more over historical time, human beings react to one another and deal with one another and have to come to agreements with one another and engage with one another and talk to one another, the more we become aware of the humanity of others as something that we respond to as an extension of our responses to those human beings who are closest to us. And yes, I would say that the emergence of Christianity was an important part of that process, but it's a larger process than that. Coming to love one's enemy is coming to recognize the humanity of the people that one thought of as one's enemies. Take the example, it's not exactly an example of enemies, but take the example of the moral progress that consists in recognizing the wrongness of slavery. For centuries and maybe millennia, human beings who were able to rationalize the activity of making slaves of other human beings by thinking of them as lesser beings, really, because they had no communication with them. They were existed in different societies, so they weren't fully human. Perhaps they could be enslaved and used. And I should say, and it's an ad hominem point, but that's a position that sometimes seems to be endorsed in the Old Testament, where God commands the people of Israel after the Exodus from Egypt to make slaves of the heathen whom they encounter. And of course, the moral progress consists in, both within Christianity and within humanity at large, recognizing that as the anti-slave trade movement rightly said, the famous slogan was that the medallion saying of a slave saying, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And the recognition of that is what underlies the moral progress that consists in people, including, of course, the Christians who famously campaigned against the slave trade, but non-Christians as well. A recognition that this was not the way to treat one's fellow human beings. So it's the widening of the circle of humanity, I think, that constitutes that progress. And I could refer to other examples of that, including coming back, if we could do at some point, perhaps to what you said about the recognition of the rights of women. But let me stop there at that point and see what Paul's answer to Mohammed's question is.
Yes, Paul, what's your thoughts on the concept of moral progress and who got rid of the slave trade?
Well, John Stuart Mill deserves a lot of credit. But anyway, everything hangs on what you mean by moral progress. If you take a consequentialist view, just in terms of results of actions. You're not going deep enough. Now, Steven Pinker, as you may know, is a cheerleader for universal progress in almost everything. He's written a book on it, and he makes the rounds preaching this stuff as if we're on the eve of the millennium. But the whole thing rests on a very superficial understanding of what moral progress is. In a Christian or Jewish or theistic or Islamic view, God looks on the heart. God doesn't look just on the actions you perform. What are the attitudes those actions are coming from? And what Pinker misses is that in the economic improvement in many societies, there has been a reduction in scarcity of resources. And a reduction in scarcity of resources means fewer fights, not as many people fighting for very finite resources. Take the issue over water in the Middle East. If you make the water abundant, there's going to be less fighting. There's going to be less need for fighting, but that's not the benchmark for moral progress. That's a benchmark for economic convenience, and that should never be confused with moral progress. So I'm unconvinced by Pinker. I don't think he goes deep enough. He needs to look at actual human attitudes and whether unselfishness has increased. Forget about better living conditions and more money and human attitudes of selfishness and unselfishness. I know of no evidence showing that there's been grounds for cheering over improvement on that front. Take Chicago, or take the U.S. as even a worse example. Trump, of course, is sending National Guard into Chicago with ICE and other federal agents to arrest innocent people. In the U.S. in general, we have a moral cesspool in the White House. Every day we get another morally evil policy or program, and everybody's afraid of the president, so they don't object, even the congressman. There's no moral progress in that kind of setting because people are being influenced in the wrong way.
Okay, let me just put that to Richard. So, Richard, you can cite examples of human actions being more beneficial over time, but does that really mean that our personality traits are kind of humanity in itself has improved or progressed?
Well, first of all, may I just put a plea to Paul not to assess the possibility of moral progress simply on the basis of the actions of Donald Trump. Please do look wider than that, Paul. There is hope on the horizon.
Prove it.
And I'm not Steven Pinker either, though. I mean, I think the empirical evidence that Steven Pinker amasses, which is very impressive, gives us cause to hope in important respects. Human life has improved vastly for most human beings, not all, of course, but for a lot of human beings, it's improved vastly because of technical and scientific advances and so forth. That's an important part of the story. It's not the whole story, I agree. And that the question of moral progress is the question about attitudes which change. And on that, I do want to repeat what I was saying earlier, that the progress consists in our coming to recognize the humanity of our fellow human beings, whom we might previously have dismissed as just other than us, not fully human or whatever. I gave the example of slavery. Can I pick up your example, because it's a good one, I think, Paul, your example of changes in the relationship between the sexes and the movements for the emancipation of women and so forth? That's an example of what I was just saying, I think. The other dimension to it, though, I suppose, which is an important part of moral progress is groups of human beings standing up for themselves, asserting their own rights and asserting their own shared humanity. It's not just a matter of some people coming to recognize it. It's a matter also of people saying, we are human beings like you. Now, in the case of relationship between the sexes, the whole history of patriarchy is a history of male thinkers and intellectuals making totally false empirical claims about the nature of women, their capacity for rational thought. Women are just emotional beings and so forth. And it's women standing up for themselves and saying, we are just as capable of all the things that you're capable of. One of the huge changes just in my lifetime is the role of women in education. When I was a student, the university I went to, women were in a tiny minority. I'm pretty certainly less than 10% at the university I went to. Huge change since then. Equal men and women in all educational institutions. That's a change that's come about because women have stood up for themselves and said, we're as capable of learning as men are, and they've shown it. And it's a change that's been going on for, I suppose, about 150 years. And thank you for mentioning John Stuart Mill, because he played an important part of that as a male advocate of it. But it's a moral change, I would say. It's a change in attitude. It's not just a social change. It's a moral change insofar as the recognition of sexual equality as a moral value is something that's progressed over the past 150 years, and that is moral progress in my book.
Okay, Paul, gender equality, is that an example of moral progress? And if so, did it not arise through non-theistic means?
Well, I don't think, at least in the U.S., I don't think it was non-theistic means. But what I want to suggest is that we have to be careful in distinguishing actions and their consequences from actual human attitudes. And in a lot of these cases where you'd expect moral progress, you get none. Take Afghanistan toward women, or take Saudi Arabia toward women. I mean, there's still moral cesspools, even though our president praised Saudi Arabia this week for its wonderful lead on human rights. I mean, if that isn't morally offensive, what is? I mean, that's just unbelievable. But anyway, what I'm trying to get to is the point that even if in certain communities people come around to a change in attitude, generalizing on that to the human species is very dangerous stuff. It shouldn't be done because we have huge sectors of human society across cultures where women are still abused each and every day, excluded. They are not given anything near equal rights to males. So male domination continues to dominate, and we just shouldn't get cheery about this the way Pinker, for example, does. Yes, if there is improvement in some sector, some corner, great, but getting general about it, our evidence just isn't there.
Final comments from each of you. I want you to take 30 seconds while I'm talking and just think of a take-home message that you want to leave our viewers with on the basis of this conversation. So something that's arisen from this conversation, that some sort of synthesis, perhaps, maybe that's too much, to see whether there's something that our viewers can take home from this.
Well, I will pick up on that last point, if I may, and then try to link it to a more general one. It's a slow process, and I'm not making any claims about our having achieved utopia. There's a long way to go. I'd want to steer a middle line between what sounds like a rather defeatist position on Paul's part and a Pollyanna-ish position of the kind that you get from Steven Pinker. But there is moral progress, and there's moral progress because of the ways in which human communities have evolved and our relationships to one another have evolved. And what that brings us back to then is the point with which I began. Moral values are rooted in our relationships to one another, and as those relationships change and develop over time and bring us more and more into contact with other human beings, so our moral awareness and our moral conscience grows and becomes deeper.
I don't like to rain on parades, but if you're thinking about morality and atheism, think funeral procession to final demise. Let's be candid. I'm all for candor here. You need candor. If that's the end of the story, own it and then ask yourself this. Why bother with inconvenient morality? When morality becomes inconvenient, why bother if this is just a funeral procession to a final demise, as it is, given the metaphysics of atheism? Let's own that, be candid about it, and then ask, might there be an alternative? And then spend the rest of our lives looking to see, with candor, if there's an actual alternative. I claim there is. I can't tell the story now, or Muhammad would cut me off, but I do think there's a feasible, evidence-based alternative, and we should put our minds to it seriously. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank both of you for taking part and setting an example for how discussions like this should be conducted. Diametrically opposed views, respectful at all times, and both intellectually rigorous and cordial. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Appreciate it,
Thank you.
Richard and Muhammad.
Thank you.
you.